Hi, I'm Margaret Fox, editor here at Stratfor, and joining me today is Fred Burton, our Vice President of Intelligence, to talk a little bit about aircraft hijackings and how U.S. agencies respond in those crisis situations. So, Fred, last week we saw an Egypt Air flight on a short flight within Egypt diverted to Cyprus. In this case, it was a single hijacker, unaffiliated with a larger terrorist network, and everyone, thank goodness, was released safely, but that hasn't always been the case. In the past, we've seen terrorist groups like Black September hijack aircraft. Why has this been such a popular method for terrorist groups?
It's the perfect terrorist vehicle. If you think in concept of the events on 9/11, for example, it's always been that kind of spectacular event that's been the holy grail of terrorist groups going back to Black September, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine.
And you worked many of these sorts of hijackings back in the 80s when you were working with the DSS, correct?
Correct. Worked several hijacking cases in the 80s and into the 90s, and they pretty much stopped. But I can tell you just the chaos that it caused in international travel, not only for commercial passenger travel, but for government agents too, because we were always very worried about being taken hostage on an aircraft while carrying either your special agent credentials or a diplomatic passport, because we have had cases in the past where the terrorist group would collect passports, then separate passengers based upon nationality. And
that did happen in this case, at least at first. I think the perpetrator did actually capture people's passports and had everyone very, very worried. So you mentioned, at the time, you and your colleagues were very concerned about these kinds of events. What kinds of processes did you put in place to respond to these events?
Well, the fascinating part, if you look at this from an aviation security perspective, is you can go back and look at these kinds of hijacking events and bombings too, causing drastic shifts in how aviation security has transpired. For example, metal detectors and the basics of even screening luggage going into the hold, or screening things such as U.S. mail. For many, many years, U.S. mail wasn't even screened that was going into the passenger hold of commercial aviation. So if you think about this from just an evolutionary perspective in the physical security arena, security today on aircraft is so much better from just checking passengers, checking for guns, checking for bombs. So when you get a hijacking like what unfolded recently with the plane on the tarmac in Larnaca, Cyprus, I immediately kind of flash back to the days when we would have these spectacular attacks and you're trying to figure out the motive and the purpose and what's behind them.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that the kinds of security improvements that you just mentioned are the reason that we see fewer hijackings today?
I think so. I think that the physical security upgrades that we've seen with not only at airports, but just how that's managed and just the physical access controls as to who has access to the aircraft when it's on the tarmac has gotten so much better today. And so when you do have a hijacking like what we saw unfold, it does cause all of the international counterterrorism community to think about that from a lessons learned perspective, meaning even though this was taken over by what appears to be a mentally disturbed person with no organized links to terror, you can still learn a lot regarding how did he plan this, how did he manufacture the device that was made to look like a suicide vest. So there's a tremendous amount of lessons learned for these. And so from a role-playing scenario or from a contingency planning scenario for the counterterrorism forces behind the scenes, this is the kind of event that causes everybody to kind of come together and practice from a real-life scenario.
Now, in this case, it was an Egypt-flagged aircraft landing in Cyprus. Why would U.S. agencies get involved at all?
Well, remember, it's a crime, a federal statute, if you have Americans on board an aircraft that have been taken hostage. So this is the kind of case that the U.S. government, specifically the Department of Justice and the FBI, investigate. So if you have one American or a dual national aboard any kind of foreign flag carrier, that's going to be a violation of U.S. law.
Got it. Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on this. Hopefully, we see fewer and fewer of these kinds of hijackings going forward, thanks to improved security and procedures like the ones that you've talked about.
Let's hope so.
Yeah. And thank you so much for watching. For more on this and other topics, please do visit our website, stratfor.com.